and Samothraki, which with the reefs that almost connect them form a natural breakwater. The wind and sea were rising, and the fleet anchored inside the shelter of the islands and reefs. It was not until 26 September that it reached at length the harbour of Corfu. It had taken 10 days to complete a passage that the tourist from Messina to Corfu now covers in a single day. At Corfu the commandant of the fortress had terrible tales to tell of Ulugh Ali's raid on the island and the horrors that the Turks had perpetrated in the villages, which now presented a scene of ruin and desolation. Gil d'Andrada rejoined the fleet there. He had not seen the Turkish armament, but he had obtained news of it from coasters and fishermen. He estimated from these reports that it was inferior in numbers to the Christian fleet, and he had learned that, as if conscious of its weakness, it had taken shelter well up the Gulf of Corinth, in the Bay of Lepanto. The bay lies eastward of the point where the gulf contracts into a narrow strait between the castles of Roumelia and the Morea, then held by the Turks. The defences were of such strength that at the time the strait was popularly known as the Little Dardanelles. It was thought that it would be hopeless for the allied fleet to attempt to force the passage. 4 days were spent in the waters of Corfu, and 4,000 troops of the garrison were embarked. Gil d'Andrada's 4 galleys had again been sent away to reconnoitre the enemy. On 30 September the weather was fine and the wind favourable, so Don Juan led his fleet from Corfu to the Bay of Gomenizza, 30 miles to the southeast, on the coast of Albania. The galleasses guarded the entrance of the bay, the galleys were moored inside it, bow on to the shore, with their guns thus directed towards it. Working parties were landed under their protection to obtain supplies of wood and water. On 2 October some Spaniards engaged in the work were surprised and made prisoners by Turkish irregulars, Albanian horsemen, who carried them off to the headquarters of Ali Pasha, the Turkish generalissimo, at Lepanto. Gil d'Andrada rejoined at Gomenizza with news that the Turkish fleet was not more than 200 strong, that pestilence had broken out among its fighting men, and that many of the galleys were undermanned. This encouraged Don Juan to attempt an attack upon it as they lay in the Gulf. But Ali Pasha had also received reports that led him to underrate the strength of the Christian armada, and so induced him to put out to sea in search of it. Twice he had reconnoitred the allied fleet. Before Don Juan arrived at Messina, Ulugh Ali had sent one of his corsairs, Kara Khodja, to cruise in Sicilian waters. The corsair painted every part of his ship a dead black, and one dark night, under black sails, he slipped into Messina harbour. The utter daring of his enterprise assisted him. Gliding like a ghost about the roadstead, unmarked and unchallenged, he counted galleys, galleasses, and frigates, and brought back an underestimate of the allied strength, only because the fleet was not yet all assembled. He repeated his exploit while the fleet lay in the waters of Corfu. He could not approach so closely as at Messina, but what he saw led him to believe it was no stronger than when he first reconnoitred it. When Ali Pasha questioned the prisoners taken at Gomenizza, using torture to make them answer him, he thought their admissions confirmed Kara Khodja's reports. So he decided to come out of Lepanto and attack the allied armada. Thus each fleet believed the other to be inferior in strength, and consequently desired an early engagement. The Turkish fleet was made up of 210 galleys and 64 galliots and smaller craft, 274 sail in all, and its commander, Ali Pasha, was one of the veteran admirals of Suleiman's victorious days. 25,000 soldiers had been embarked under the Seraskier, or general, Pertev Pasha. Ali had organized his fleet in 4 divisions: center, right wing, left wing, and reserve. All the ships had oars as well as sails, and though Ali had no huge floating batteries, like the 6 galleasses of Don Juan's fleet, the Turkish admiral could match the Christians with galley for galley, and have a surplus of 8 galleys and 66 smaller craft. Of these the 44 galliots were almost as useful as the galleys. Unlike the latter, which had 2 and often 3 masts, the galliot had only 1 and was smaller in size. But the Turkish galliots, mostly belonging to the piratical states of North Africa, were as large as many of the Christian galleys of the second class. They could sail well, and they were manned by crews of fighting men that had a long record of piratical warfare. The organization of Ali's fleet was: Main line of battle. Division, right wing. Galleys 54, galliots 2, total 56. Division Center. Galleys 87, Galleots 8, total 95. Division Left Wing. Galleys 61, Galleots 32, total 93. Division Reserve. Galleys 8, Galleots 2, smaller craft 20, total 30. Totals: 210 galleys, 44 galleots, 20 smaller craft, total 274. The 50 galleys of the right wing were ships from Egypt, the ports of Asia Minor, and the arsenal of Constantinople, united under the command of Mohammed Chuluk Bey, governor of Alexandria, known among the Christian sailors of the Mediterranean as Mohammed Shirako. The centre, commanded by Ali in person, was made up of galleys from Rhodes and the Greek islands, and from Constantinople and Gallipoli, and the Tripolitan squadron under Jafir Aga, governor of Tripoli. The left under Ulugh Ali, the viceroy of Algiers, included ships from Constantinople, Asia Minor, Syria, and the ports of northwest Africa. The reserve, chiefly composed of small craft, was under the command of Murad Dragut of Constantinople. There were a good many Greek and Calabrese renegades among the captains of the galleys, but the Syrians and the mixed Arab race of Alexandria had learned the ways of the sea. Some even of the Turks were good sailors, and the men of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers had made the sea their element. The thousands of rowers, who provided the propelling power of the galleys, were for the most part Christian slaves, chained to their heavy oars, by which they slept when the fleet anchored, living a life of weary labour, often half starved, always badly clothed, so that they suffered from cold and wet. Death was the immediate penalty of any show of insubordination, and the whip of their taskmasters kept them to their work. There were men of all classes among them, sailors taken from prizes, passengers who had the bad luck to be on board captured ships, fishermen and tillers of the soil carried off in coast raids. They were short-lived, for their masters did not spare them, and considered it a more economic policy to work the rowers to the utmost and replace them by other captures when they broke down. The oarsmen of the allied fleet had also a hard lot, but not as bad as that of Ali Pasha's galley slaves, because in the Christian fleet there was a considerable proportion of men hired for the campaign. But there was also a servile element, Turks taken prisoner in previous campaigns and chained to the oar in reprisal for the treatment of Christian captives by Ottoman commanders, and a considerable number of what we should now call convicts, sentenced to hard labour, a rough lot of murderers, brigands, thieves, and the like. It must be remembered that in most European countries the sentence for such offences would have been death. The convict galley slaves of Don Juan's fleet were encouraged by the prospect of winning either complete pardon or a remission of part of their sentences if there was a victory, and to enable them to cooperate in winning it, they were told that they would be freed from their chains and armed when the day of battle came. The 25,000 fighting men of Ali Pasha's fleet were chiefly militia. There were only a few thousand of the formidable Janissaries, and among the small arms of the Turkish fleet there were more bows and arrows than muskets. Don Juan had, on the other hand, a considerable number of arquebusiers on his ships. He had the further advantage that while even the largest of the Turkish galleys had only low bulwarks, the galleys of the allied fleet were provided with pavesades, large bucklers and shields, to be fitted among the bulwarks when clearing for action, and also permanent cross barriers to prevent a raking fire fore and aft. When Ali left the roadstead of Lepanto and brought his fleet out from behind the batteries of the Little Dardanelles, he believed he had such a marked superiority over the allied fleet that victory was a certainty, and he expected to find Don Juan either at Gomenizza or in the waters of the Ionian Islands. Pertev Pasha and several of the admirals had opposed Ali's decision, and had urged him either to remain at Lepanto or run out of the Gulf, round the Morea, and wait in the eastern seas for the campaign of next year. Their reason for this advice was that many of the fighting men were new levies unused to the sea, but Ali's self-confidence made him reject this prudent counsel. On 2 October, Don Juan had made up his mind to leave Gomenizza, enter the Gulf of Corinth, and risk an attack on the passage of the Little Dardanelles. Accordingly, in the afternoon, he gave orders that the fleet should prepare to sail at sunrise next day. During the long delay in the island waters belated news came that